In 1933, a book would be published by a relatively obscure British author that would come to not only change the course of the author's young life, but would also have lasting influence on the English language itself. Now, my name's Dan, you're watching Bookworm History, and this is Lost Horizon by James Hilton. James Hilton was born on September 9th, 1900, in Lancashire, England, the son of two schoolteachers. He was 13 when World War I broke out, and although at the age of 14 he was given a scholarship to study in Hertfordshire, he was ultimately pulled out of the school by his father. His father, being a pacifist, objected to the Hertfordshire schools having a cadet corps and a rifle range. Later in 1914, he would go on a tour of English schools looking for a public school that would appeal to him, as his father was unable to make up his mind about which school the young James should attend. Young Hilton ultimately chose to enroll at the Leys School in Cambridge, where he would attend from 1915 until 1918. During his time there, he would become the editor of the school paper, to which he would contribute many short stories as well as articles. It was also at the Leys that Hilton would make the acquaintance of one W.H. Balgarnie, the classics master, who would instruct from the school from 1900 until 1929, and again from 1940 until 1946. Being affectionately known as Uncle, the elder Balgarnie would have a significant influence on young Hilton, as well as on his future literary career. From 1918 until 1921, Hilton would attend Christ's College, also in Cambridge, and 1920 would see the appearance of Hilton's first novel, titled Catherine Herself. Upon graduation and until 1930, Hilton would move back in with his parents and primarily earn his living as a columnist in the Dublin Independent, where he would write a twice-weekly column, as well as contributing book reviews and other columns to assorted various other papers. It was also during this period that he would pen several more novels, and although he would gradually approach literary success, he would never quite achieve it. The winter of 1932 to 1933 saw James Hilton spending a lot of time at the British Library, deep in research for a new book. He would spend 6 weeks penning this new novel, from March to April of 1934. Feeling it to be his best work, he submitted it to prestigious British publishing house Macmillan, not really expecting it to be accepted. When it was accepted, Hilton began to have doubts about the title. He wrote a letter to Mr. Macmillan himself on the 9th of May, 1933, saying, "I have for some time been feeling that Blue Moon, as the book was then called, is not a particularly good title for the new book, especially as so many people seem to think it has a musical comedy flavor. This morning my American publisher has cabled me to the same effect, and says also that the title has already been used in the US. I think, apart from getting a better title, it would be an advantage to have the same one on both sides, and I hope, if you agree, to have an alternative suggestion ready in a day or two." He would write back to Macmillan 2 days later, saying, "I'm glad you were in agreement that Blue Moon could be improved upon, and I believe Mr. Squire thought so too. My own preference for an alternative is Lost Horizon, which seems to me both appropriate and attractive." The novel centers around 4 people, 3 British, 1 American, who are hijacked upon leaving Baskul, or currently Kabul, Afghanistan, during an uprising in 1930. They are flown across the Himalayas to a mysterious monastery in the shadow of Karakel, or Blue Moon as it's called to the monastery's residents. The residents of the monastery, or Shangri-La as it's referred to, are at peace to a degree that the main character, Hugh Conway, has never before seen or experienced himself. Also, within the shadow of Blue Moon, people seem to live extraordinarily long lives. Hilton uses the novel to discuss his views on war and essentially the human condition. In light of World War II, his words about death from the skies and subsequent coming battles or an oncoming storm seem oddly prophetic for having been written in 1933. With Hilton having high hopes for the book, it saw the light of day in September of 1933, and, well, nothing happened. It was put out in an original 3,000 print run, which did sell, and prompted another 3,000 print run shortly thereafter, but sales were very slow. The book's slow sales did pick up, and quickly, in June of 1934, as a result of 2 things taking place almost simultaneously. The first is that Hilton and Lost Horizon would win the prestigious Hawthornden Prize. This was awarded to a British writer under the age of 41 for the most imaginative piece of writing having been published within the previous year. The publishing house Macmillan put out the Hawthornden Prize edition of Lost Horizon, which did go to boost sagging sales of the novel. The second event, which would boost sagging sales and ultimately make Hilton a household name, was the publication of a short novel that Hilton wrote the previous winter called Goodbye, Mr. Chips. It would be published in June of 1934 in book form, although it had previously been published in magazine form. And while it was only 18,000 words, it would go on to bring Hilton critical acclaim and improve sales not only of Goodbye, Mr. Chips, but also of Lost Horizon. As a result of the Hawthornden Prize and the success of Goodbye, Mr. Chips, the popularity of James Hilton and Lost Horizon itself would skyrocket. In 1935, Frank Capra would direct a cinematic version of Lost Horizon. One of the lingering questions about Lost Horizon itself is whether or not Shangri-La is in fact a real place, or whether a real place had any influence on Hilton in creating his version. An early seed for Lost Horizon can be seen in a previous Hilton novel, published in 1927, called Terry. In Terry, the narrator would comment, "I am thinking, of course, of the great Tibetan monastery sensation. Karelsky traveled apparently in Tibet, and somehow or other obtained an entrance into an old and inaccessible monastery, in which, to his astonishment, he found that his own methods of rejuvenation had been practiced for hundreds of years, so that, in fact, many of the monks were actually in their 3rd and 4th centuries." Many of those plot points would serve as major plot points within the novel Lost Horizon. It's worthwhile to note that a lot of the popularity of Lost Horizon was seen in the 1930s as a result of its dealing with a previously lost world or unknown world. Previous entrances into the genre would include Rider Haggard's King Solomon's Mines or Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World. As a result of the world not having yet been fully mapped or even explored, it was very appealing to people to think that such paradises could in fact still exist, even though they had escaped the sight of modern map makers. One of Hilton's primary influences in writing Lost Horizon, as far as setting up the landscape and the background of Tibet, was a series of National Geographic articles published by American explorer Joseph Rock, who had traveled extensively within the Tibetan Himalayas. There was an area of the Himalayas, a civilization referred to as Muli, which is described by Rock as being a very idyllic community in the shadow of a mountain he refers to as a Great Pyramid, which could possibly be the inspiration for the Karakel Mountain, which Hilton writes about in Lost Horizon. So although the scene and many of the descriptions of the Himalayas or of communities, monasteries high up in the Himalayas, may have been based on real places, Hilton himself would go on to answer the question of whether or not Shangri-La itself was a real place, or whether he had actually found any evidence of such a lost civilization. He would later write, "No, there is a large amount of reading behind them. The mountain of Karakel is imaginary. I don't suppose there is so lovely a mountain anywhere, and it would be difficult to find in Tibet a lamasery as clean as Shangri-La, but much of what I have written about is true. There is plenty of evidence, for instance, to support the ideas I have introduced of longevity and telepathy." Ultimately, although writers, readers, and explorers in coming decades would be fascinated by the idea of finding a Shangri-La, Hilton himself did not actually visit Tibet prior to writing the book, similar to the way that Bram Stoker had never been to Transylvania prior to writing Dracula. Ultimately, the legacy of Lost Horizon would be, through the decades, one of commentary on war, as well as describing the idea of finding such an earthly paradise, or an idyllic community, lost somewhere, unseen by modern eyes, still out there, waiting to be discovered. Well, that's all we've got for you today. I hope you liked the show. If you did, be sure to give us a big thumbs up down below, hit that like button. Be sure to hit subscribe on your way out so that you stay up to date on all of our latest episodes and happenings. Also, be sure to check out our new travel show, Hometown History. Our first episode is currently up on the channel about Hodgenville, Kentucky. I do hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time, and thanks for stopping by.